Double Down, the live online news and affairs programme that puts people first. It's Thursday, the 13th of May 2021. We're broadcasting live from Dundalk, Dublin, and Longford, and we're your hosts, Finbar Markey and Anna Kavanagh. Welcome to the show, everyone. We hope you've had a peaceful week. It's been a very busy week in terms of news and events around the world and in Ireland, and that will be reflected very much in tonight's show. Tonight, my guest will in fact be my co host, Anna Kavanagh, and she'll be presenting her usual news and views. But she's also going to discuss in some detail the contradictions and the conflicts of science and advice between our own chief medical officer and international and respected researchers and experts themselves. Before joining Anna for what I expect will be a very interesting discussion, let's look at the news that you won't see on TV. First in Irish news, and the mother of a 13-year-old Irish girl from Dundalk is pleading with the government and health services to provide proper services for her anorexic daughter. The 13-year-old girl has been in the general hospital for over 9 weeks, with little prospect of a specialist bed becoming available. There are no residential eating disorder services available on the island of Ireland currently. The mother of the 13-year-old, Elizabeth McCrave, told Kitty Holland of the Irish Times this week that she fears that her daughter will die if she does not receive specialist treatment. Local TD Rory Murchu also raised the issue in the Dáil this week. It is reported that the concerned minister has ordered an urgent report into the matter. March has seen another year-on-year home price rise, with house prices rising by 3.7%. House prices in Dublin rose by an average of 2.5%, and outside Dublin, prices rose 4.9%. As house prices continue to skyrocket beyond the means of the average Irish worker, last night the government voted against a Sinn Féin bill seeking to stop vulture funds buying up housing estates. The highest number of deaths of people in homeless services was recorded in the first 3 months of 2021, with at least 38 known deaths of people without home in that 3 month period. Last year, 79 people engaging services were known to have died in the entire year. This year looks set to exceed that figure and possibly even double the number of deaths unless drastic action is taken. The Social Democrats and the Green Party have surprised pundits by voting in favour of Ireland's further participation in the European Defence Agency, the EDA. The European Defence Agency is in effect an agency formulating a European army by incremental steps. Critics have argued that such cooperation is in effect membership of NATO, and that Ireland cannot claim to be neutral and continue to participate in the EDA. Mick Barry of the Socialist Party, a Cork TD, has criticised the Social Democrats and the Green Party for their support of further integration into this military pact. Peadar Tóibín of the political party Aontú has once more lashed out at the €25,000 per day cost of housing the government in the National Convention Centre in Dublin. With the government only meeting at the most twice per week or 2 days per week, and with minimum attendance due to COVID restrictions, the €25,000 per day fee has come under increasing criticism from Tobin, who has argued for a return to regular government business in its usual location at the House of the Oireachtas. No plans have been announced as yet for a return to Kildare Street. Members and representatives of the Irish fishing industry have this week stated that they are close to taking action to bring an end to what some have described as the strangulation of the indigenous fishing industry in Ireland. In a move that is expected to make the Irish government sit up and listen, the Irish Seafood Alliance has said in a public statement that many of their members are close to taking blockading action and that conflict is on the horizon, and that was a quotation. Insiders in the industry have said that such actions may include blocking Dublin port for days, weeks and even months, unless the sorry plight of the Irish industry is addressed. The latest challenges to the industry is the reduction of the quota due to the Brexit agreement and a disagreement over weighing of catch at ports, with Irish fishing vessels expected to weigh water as well as their catch of fish. And finally, in Irish news, David Drum, the ex-Anglo banker, has been recently photographed driving a new €80,000 sports Range Rover. Although it's not known if the vehicle is his own, the ex-banker, central to the Irish banking collapse, does not appear to be suffering unduly from guilt or punishment for his part in Ireland's worst economic crisis. In international news, and in Colombia, street protests and violent paramilitary police crackdown has seen many more deaths of peaceful protesters, with the indications of the unrest that is unabating. Massive crowds gathered outside the Colombian parliament yesterday to show their outrage at the shooting dead of protest leader Lucas Villa by paramilitary forces supported by the current regime. The current regime, which in themselves are supported by the United States and led by Ivan Durka, failed to reach agreement on how to appease the demonstrators, who originally were demonstrating a new tax regime, but now are protesting at the death of at least 20 of their fellow activists. And finally, no one can ignore the terror that is happening in Palestine and Israel right now. Last night, I, like I'm sure many other people, had tears in their eyes as they watched mobs of Israeli youths hunting down Palestinians, smashing up Palestinian businesses, beating up, and in some instances, beating Palestinians to death. We had to have a discussion on Double Down whether we would actually show any of this footage, because it is very disturbing. But we decided that in the end we would show some of the footage, but the most extreme footage of Palestinians being beaten to death, quite literally, we will not show on the programme. But Stephen's going to roll one or two pieces of footage from last night, and reports we've checked on Twitter with reliable sources from the area, and it would appear that this carnage and this terror is starting again today. Stephen, if you'd like to roll a few of those pieces of footage, and then at the end I'd like to finish up with a piece of footage posted by some Palestinian children at the top of the exact moment that bombs began to fall in their neighbourhood. Stephen, if you could roll some of that footage for me, please.
אנחנו רואים כאן לינץ' בשידור חי דוריה.
יש מישהו בתוך הרכב הזה?
יש ככל הנראה מישהו, רגע אנחנו מנסים לראות אם יש או שהוא נחלץ וברח, אבל אפשר לראות איך ההמון פה פשוט מכה בזה אחר זה את הרכב, מנפץ את השמשות. יש פה אנשים גם שספויים על הקרקע.
אני לא חושבת שאנחנו... يا رب
The horror, the trauma that's happening in Israel right now. Okay, we're going to move on, folks. We'll leave you with that. Please God, we'll be coming back next week to say that things have calmed down in Israel and Palestine, and that the vicious attacks both by mobs on the streets of both Palestinian and Israeli towns and cities, Israeli mobs, I don't know how to describe them, Zionist, I don't know what word to use at this stage. Apparently, if you criticize this kind of thing now, you're anti-Semitic. So hopefully next week we'll be broadcasting that this has all stopped and that there's some kind of peace has been established in that area. Okay, we're going to turn to our usual co-host, my usual co-host, Anna Kavanagh. We're not going to have a special guest this week. Anna will do her usual spot at the end of her news and views, but she has been very upset, as I have, in relation to some of the conflicts of information and advice that has been given out by our Chief Medical Officer and other experts in Ireland, and how that is conflicting with international best practice advice and best science that is coming out internationally. So without further ado, I'm going to turn straight over to Anna, who can give us a download on what these conflicts are in her own simple and clear way. Anna, first of all, thanks for joining us for this special extra feature that you're doing tonight.
Good evening, everybody. The issue of antigen testing erupted into a major controversy over the last week. But before we look at this controversy, it's important that we look at the background. Deputy Michael McNamara has for many months now been raising this issue in the Dáil. I want to take a look now at a video that dates to the 28th of January.
Before Christmas, I called for greater use of antigen testing, or at least for the possibility of it to be explored in line with Commission recommendations. I note that it will now be used in respect of ports, but is there not a role for antigen testing in our hospitals, in our schools potentially when they open back up, and in our airports in the absence of quarantine, that perhaps from safer countries at least, that people could use antigen testing to ensure that that travel is taking place in a safe manner?
Thanks, Deputy. I broadly agree that there is a role, and a greater role, for antigen testing in Ireland into the future. But we have to be guided by public health advice on this. And NPHET, as you know, haven't been particularly confident about the accuracy of antigen testing, and believe in many instances that it doesn't meet what the manufacturers say. But they have updated their guidance only in the last couple of days, so antigen testing is now going to be used more extensively for outbreaks and also for symptomatic cases. And they've actually changed the definition of case in Ireland to take into account the fact that somebody may test positive on an antigen test and not just on a PCR test. So that is a significant change only in the last couple of days. Using it, for example, to screen people for travel or to screen people to attend events is a whole other thing.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And the evidence at the moment is that antigen testing is effective in symptomatic cases, but not so much for screening, but that may change.
Deputy Michael McNamara questioning the Taoiseach, that Leo Varadkar, on the 28th of January. And did you notice how the Taoiseach said that NPHET had changed the definition of a case to include a case that was involving antigen testing? So on the 18th of February, Deputy McNamara questioned the Taoiseach once again.
The European Commission have advocated the use of antigen testing. The Irish government said no, it wasn't good enough to take up the 20 million antigen tests offered by the European Commission. Wasn't good enough to facilitate visits to nursing homes, wasn't good enough to facilitate the return to school and make schools safer. But lo and behold, we woke up on Monday morning and we find out that the Department of Agriculture are facilitating the antigen testing of workers in meat plants. Workers who operate under bonded labour effectively, because your department, won't change the work permit system. If it's good enough in this sector, why is it not good enough for others? My question is not about the decision. I don't disagree with the decision. But how are decisions made by your government? Because it seems strange that it couldn't be even looked at for every other sector. But when Larry and the lads rock up, it's yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. So if every other country in the EU thinks that it's safe to use antigen testing, not as an alternative to PCR testing, not as a clinical diagnosis, but to get society back functioning again, what is the obstacle in Ireland?
I support the greater use of antigen testing in Ireland, and I'm on the record as having said that on a number of occasions, but that does have to be subject to public health advice and the approval of NPHET and HICWA as well, which advises on this too. It is now being used in outbreaks and it has been tested in some clinical scenarios such as outbreaks in hospitals. So it has been used in recent weeks under the direction of NPHET and the HSC. The problem with it is it misses a large number of positive cases. particularly asymptomatic cases. So whereas a PCR test might miss 15–20% of positives, an antigen test will miss many more positives, particularly asymptomatic cases, and that could give a false reassurance.
Taoiseach, this false positive and reassurance is a bit like the argument against giving out condoms during the HIV pandemic, that people would feel reassured and behave on that basis. Frankly, I don't buy it, because every single person who's detected is somebody who wouldn't otherwise be detected. It's not that we're taking people away from PCR testing to antigen testing. It's in addition to its screening. So I simply don't accept that argument.
That was Deputy Michael McNamara on the 18th of February. And then later on in the month, he questioned the Taoiseach Micheál Martin. This time, the issue was over the conflict of interest between ENFIT members and the laboratories that are doing the PCR testing.
The European Commission advocated greater use of antigen testing in November. It's been rolled out right across Europe. The Biden administration have now introduced far greater use of antigen testing in America, including in homes. Here, NPHET have finally moved, and reluctantly, to a very circumscribed role for antigen testing in the context of outbreaks, and only in that context. Is there a conflict of interest between being chair of NPHET and director of the National Virus Laboratory Institute, which has very large contracts with the state for PCR testing? And that's a simple, I'm not saying there's any subjective bias by that member of NPHET, but there's a clear perception, there's objective bias, or a clear possibility of it. What is the reluctance to antigen testing? Because whatever opening up will take place in March will have to be done safely.
Thank you, Deputy.
And there is a role for antigen testing in our hospitals, in our schools, and especially in our homes. What is the reluctance in this state to that?
From what I can surmise and gather from the discussions I've had, they believe the PCR test is gold standard. They believe you can miss a lot through antigen testing. But that said, they have advised now that it can be used in outbreak settings. I think in any future committee engagements, for example, I know you chaired the COVID committee, so you would have, I presume, have discussed this and discussed zero COVID and all the range of issues that were brought before that committee throughout the summer. Yeah. So in terms of, I think that's not, I wouldn't accept your point that there's a conflict of interest between being chair of NPHET and being the director of the NVRL. I think, to be fair to all concerned, everybody has come together in different contexts to help the country defeat,
thank you, Taoiseach,
and suppress COVID-19. I think we should accept people's bona fides in that regard. And like, there's reluctance within the political sphere and within government sphere to override this kind of device. We're not experts on. I'm not an expert in testing or the most efficacious.
Please, deputies.
No, but they have their experts. But I mean, we can't just pick and choose a la carte.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
There's structures within the country. There's a clinical advisory. There's public health advice.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Dr. Cillian de Gascon chaired the expert advisory group, a subcommittee of ENFIT, until it was stood down before Christmas, and he remains a member of ENFIT. Dr. Gascon is also director of the National Virus Reference Laboratory. It has a state contract to do PCR testing that was worth 11.95 million in 2020. It also subcontracts PCR testing to other laboratories. ENFAR, the Tipperary diagnostic company controlled by businessman Louis Ronan, was last year paid 122.4 million to process COVID-19 tests. And now to the controversy that erupted last weekend when Lidl began to sell antigen tests. Lidl began selling the antigen tests for $24.99 per pack of 5. Speaking at Friday's ENFIT press briefing, Dr. Holohan warned people not to buy the Lidl antigen tests. He said, and I quote, "Someone could go into the supermarket and buy a pound of sausages and charcoal for a barbecue as well as a test. That represents a real test." We're going to look now at how the print media responded to Dr. Holohan's request. The Irish Mirror had a headline, Dr. Tony Holohan slams little antigen tests, warning people not to buy or use them. The Irish Examiner, don't rely on home testing kits for COVID, Tony Holohan urges. The Irish Times, NPHET warns public against relying on antigen tests being sold in supermarkets. Chief Medical Officer Tony Holohan genuinely concerned at sale of such kits. And finally, RTE, CMO very concerned over supermarket antigen tests. Little's tongue-in-cheek tweet in response to Tony Holohan the next day was, weekend super savers, pick up a pound of sausages, charcoal for the barbecue and antigen tests for €31. It was the response to this tweet by Professor Philip Nolan, the president of Maynooth University and the chair of NPHET's Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, that caused a major hullabaloo. And I quote, "Can I get some snake eye with that? It makes for a very good salad dressing with a pinch of salt and sometimes something acerbic. These antigen tests will not keep you safe." Dr. Michael Mina is the Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at Harvard University. He tweeted on Sunday in reply to Nolan, and I quote, "For an advisor to your government, you don't appear to know what you're talking about. This comment adds nothing of benefit and further sows confusion. You should be ashamed of your demeanour here." The response from Irish mainstream media to a Harvard professor telling an NPHET expert that he doesn't know what he's talking about is shocking and displays the almost 100% deference by the media to Tony Holohan and NPHET for the last year. The Mirror headline, "Harvard expert tells NPHET's Philip Nolan he should be ashamed over little tweet," is in stark contrast to Paul Cullen in the Irish Times online report under the heading, "Supermarket antigen test will not keep you safe." This report did not appear in Monday's print edition of the Times. Only the Mirror reported the Mina-Nolan controversy. That is up until Wednesday, when an opinion piece was carried by the Irish Independent. There was also a negative response to Nolan's tweet from medical professionals. Matter Private consultant Michael Kavanagh accused NPHET of grandstanding on the antigen test issue because they want to be in control of the data and the narrative. On Monday, ISME, the body that represents small and medium-sized businesses, wrote to the Minister for Health to express its serious concern with Tony Holohan and the chair of the Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, Professor Philip Nolan, about the use of rapid antigen testing. In the letter, they said, and I quote, "They accused the utility of rapid antigen testing in the workplace has clearly been described by experts in the World Health Organization, the Centre for Disease Control in the United States, and by the European Centre for Disease Control. If NPHET is privy to scientific advice contrary to the guidance of these bodies, it should publish it immediately," the letter said. On Tuesday, Stephen Donnelly finally got around to describing the comment by Nolan as unhelpful and said antigen testing is one of the tools that can be used in the fight against COVID-19. And now I'm going to show you two videos. The first video is of Professor Mark Ferguson. He appeared by video link before the Joint Committee on Transport and Communication Network to discuss antigen testing on Wednesday, the 5th of May. Now, I haven't come across any mainstream media reports about this meeting, and we'll have a look at this short video clip from that meeting.
I think you need to understand that a PCR test and an antigen test are about different things. So since this is a transport committee, people often talk about the PCR test as being the Rolls-Royce test. Well, the kind of analogy is, if you can't have a Rolls-Royce car, you shouldn't have any car. But that's nonsense. You know, if I wanted to travel over Africa, I wouldn't choose a Rolls-Royce car, I'd choose a Land Rover. If I wanted to be green and save the planet, I would choose an electric car, not a Rolls-Royce that burns so much petrol per gallon. And what that tells you is that it depends what question you're asking. So a antigen test basically detects infectious people. It detects an individual who's got a high viral load that's likely to have live virus and that is likely to transmit that virus to other people. And that's what you want to do. You want to remove those infectious people from the workforce or from the aeroplane or from general society, get them to isolate until they're not infectious, and then you stop the spread of the virus. A PCR test detects the nucleic acid of a virus, and that tells you when you've got a very, very small amount of virus that isn't infectious. It tells you when you're infectious, and it tells you when you're post-infectious. In other words, that you're way over having had the symptoms, but you still got some traces of the nucleic acid. So these are detecting different things. An antigen test will not tell you whether you ever had COVID. It won't tell you whether you're past COVID. It just tells you whether you're infectious at this stage. And it's that kind of mentality of equating a PCR test with an antigen test that is actually unhelpful. I mean, they're detecting different things.
You have been looking there at Professor Mark Ferguson, who appeared by video link before the Joint Committee on Transport and Communications on Wednesday, the 5th of May. Professor Ferguson is the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government. He's also chair of the COVID-19 Rapid Testing Group, and he is the Director General of Science Foundation Ireland. He was appointed by the EU Commission as only one of 12 members of a high-level group to work on research and innovation. In 1984, at the age of 28, Ferguson became the youngest ever professor in the UK, and he was awarded a CBE by the Queen in 1999 for services to health and life sciences. Now, we can see that Professor Ferguson is a very eminent scientist and very well qualified to speak about antigen and PCR tests. But the question is, why is he being stonewalled by the government? Professor Ferguson presented an expert report to the government on the 1st of April, calling for an immediate rollout of antigen testing to end lockdown. His report has been largely ignored by the government. Now, let's take a look at Tony Holohan, the Chief Medical Officer. And here he is speaking on Virgin Media News about antigen tests.
Dr. Holohan, you'd expressed concern about antigen tests being sold in a German discounter there on Friday. And just to be clear, these antigen tests that they're selling, they are as effective or otherwise as an antigen test that you might get, for example, in a chemist, or that employers might be using in some circumstances across the country right now. Isn't that the case?
So antigen tests, we think, have a role to play. They have a role to play in controlled circumstances where studies have shown and demonstrated the impact that they can have in helping to prevent transmission and helping to pick up infection earlier and perform as well as PCR tests. We know that, but we think they can have a role to play. The concern that we have is if the general public starts to use them, first of all, they don't perform as well as they do when healthcare staff use them, and second of all, the risk of a negative test leading people to believe inappropriately that they're somehow free of the disease, when even in healthcare trained professional hands, we're looking at about an average of 50% sensitivity in many of the studies that have been conducted. It means we simply we would miss too many cases and give people false reassurance that they don't have the disease, and if that led them to behave in ways where they were to facilitate the spread of the disease, we would be very, very concerned about that.
Right.
So we're really advising people not to go out and buy these antigen tests and to use them themselves.
All right, finally, Dr. Houlihan, just on vaccines, are you planning on vaccinating children? And do you think on that Johnson & Johnson, that one...
I think, having looked at the video of Professor Ferguson appearing before the Oireachtas Transport Committee and Tony Holohan speaking to Virgin Media News, that there is a clear conflict in their views on antigen testing. Now, we've seen that Professor Mark Ferguson is an eminently qualified scientist. Let's look a little bit closely now at Tony Holohan's qualifications. He graduated from medical school in UCD in 1991, and then he graduated with a master's in public health in 1996. He also has a diploma in healthcare management from the Royal College of Surgeons. Tony Holohan was appointed Deputy Chief Medical Officer in 2001, and then he was promoted to Chief Medical Officer in December 2008. Approximately 100 people are currently taking cases against the state in relation to the swine flu vaccine pandemics made by GlaxoSmithKline, who were indemnified by the state against compensation claims. The legal fees were $6 million in the first case settled by the HSE with Aoife Bennett, who has developed lifelong ailments as a result of being given the swine flu vaccine. The second compensation claim was settled with Ben Blackwell for just under $1 million. He was represented in court by barrister Dermot Gleeson, senior counsel. Mark Tighe reported in the Sunday Times on the 8th of November last, and I'm going to read now from that report. Gleeson told the judge that Blackwell's case involved harsh criticism of public health officials, including Dr. Tony Holohan, who was Chief Medical Officer in 2009. The barrister said the evidence would include transcripts of media interviews given by Holohan at the time, in which he assured the public that Pandemrix had been fully tested and was as safe as regular flu vaccines. Blackwell's senior counsel said this was untrue, as Pandemrix contained a new adjuvant, a booster ingredient that triggers an autoimmune response which had not been used previously and which had not been tested on children. Gleeson quoted interviews that Holohan did on RTE and News Talk at the time, in which he said Pandemrix was fully licensed and clinically tested, and like all other influenza vaccines, which had an excellent safety profile. On one radio show, Holohan said the adjuvant in Pandemrix was nothing new, but Gleeson insisted it was completely new. He added, "We say people weren't told the truth." Fast forward from the swine flu in 2009 to the scandal that erupted in 2018 over the false negative smear test results that came to light when Vicky Phelan settled her case against the state. Vicky is one of more than 200 women who developed cancer that was not diagnosed in time, some of whom have died. Holohan was one of the key players in this fiasco. In the wake of the scandal, he defied calls for his resignation and defended not telling Leo Varadkar, who was health minister at the time, and his successor Simon Harris, about the compensation claims the department was facing over giving the women false smear test results. Now, this raises three questions about Tony Holohan. Was it incompetence? Was he so in control of the department and calling all the shots that Varadkar and later Harris were mere puppets? Or, thirdly, could it be that he told Varadkar and later told Harris, and in order to save their political careers, he lied for them? In 2019, The Irish Examiner, using freedom of information, discovered that on the day after Vicky Phelan settled her case and called for a public inquiry into the scandal, Holohan emailed the Health Minister, Simon Harris, advising him not to have a public inquiry. To his credit, Simon Harris ignored Holohan and went ahead with an inquiry led by Professor Gabriel Scally. On Tuesday night last, RTE's Primetime did a feature on antigen testing. Strangely, it completely left out any reference to Professor Mark Ferguson, the Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, or to his appearance before the Dáil Transport Committee that we have just seen in the video clip a few minutes ago, or reference to his expert report to government calling for a speedy rollout of antigen testing. Instead, they had Ray Wally, a Dublin-based GP, telling anecdotal stories of his experience of patients using antigen tests to counter arguments that were being put forward by Harvard epidemiologist Dr. Michael Mina, who had told NPHET's Professor Nolan that he should be ashamed of his non-scientific attitude towards antigen testing that we examined a few moments ago. Dr. Mina appeared by remote link on Primetime. We'll now look at what he tweeted after his appearance. And I quote, "Surprise at lack of trust the government has in the Irish people. Instead of supporting access to simple at-home tests to tell if you're infectious, the position appears to be to limit access because they don't trust people to handle a negative test. We do not defeat a pandemic without properly engaging and trusting in the public. To actively advocate against an asymptomatic person to be able to access a rapid test that has a very high sensitivity to tell you if you're spreading the virus doesn't make sense. Overall, though, there seems to be confusion among decision makers in Ireland that these tests are not sensitive. Rapid tests do a very good job at detecting you when you are infectious, which is what matters if you're using a rapid test." And so now, I suppose the big really issue is so much controversy now around Dr. Michael Mina and his response to what is actually happening here in Ireland, and it really goes against it really goes against what is happening elsewhere. Just for the record, since the beginning of April, if you live in Northern Ireland, you can register online and antigen tests are posted free to your address, and they're also available free in pharmacies. And the big question now is, why is there so much resistance in NPHET and in the government to the rollout of antigen testing? And secondly, why is mainstream media promoting everything that Tony Holohan is saying? And very few, if anybody, knows that the government actually has a chief scientific officer and advisor in Professor Mark Ferguson. We're going to finish now by looking at a video clip of Stephen Donnelly's appearance this morning on Virgin Media with Pat Kenny, and just note the interjections from Pat Kenny in the course of the interview.
So this isn't like putting on a mask. There's a lot of serious work has to be done to make sure that people are using the right test in the right way. And then what we've got to do is really get the message out there that if you're using the right test in the right way, and if you get a positive result, you should go and get a PCR test. If you get a negative result,
that is the advice.
Yeah, but
that is the advice.
It is, but the next bit is just as important, which is if you get a negative result, you should pretty much ignore it. It doesn't mean you're negative. The best tests used in the best ways are about 50% accurate. Some of them are as low as 3 or 4% accurate. And that's the key. The real fear that people
Stephen,
have is...
this is bad. This is propaganda. This is not fact. I mean, the science indicates that properly used antigen testing reveals when people are infectious. I mean, that is the science. And now you're telling me that only one test works, and that, you know...
No, let me be clear. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert in this stuff. What I'm saying to you is that the Cochrane report, which is a well-regarded review, they found that only one single test, when you follow the manufacturer's instructions, met the minimum stipulated sensitivity and specificity, and that there is a wide variety of sensitivity, which is the positives, and some of the pilots have shown accuracy of about 3%, but others have shown accuracy in excess of 50%. The point being, Pat, if you get one of these tests and you get a negative, it doesn't mean you're negative. That's the most important thing to take away.
Stephen, you're actually saying it's pointless. There's no point in buying you're in favour of them, but there's no point in doing them. That, you know, people cannot be trusted to do it properly. And even if they are trusted to do it properly, but it's probably wrong. That's what you're saying. You cannot have it both ways, that you're in favour of them and then you disparage them.
Well, let me tell you why I think you can. I'm not disparaging them, Pat. What I'm saying is
they're useless by your last commentary. They are useless, which is not what the international experience is.
And it's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, if you get a negative result, under no circumstances does that mean that you are not infectious. And please don't behave as if you have a result that says you're not infectious. It's really important.
One has to ask oneself why Double Down, the Irish Inquiry, and in particular Anna Kavanagh, are the only medium in this country that's reporting like this, and that's looking into these serious contradictions and basic conflicts of information that may be damaging this country far more than we might consider if we were to just bypass this kind of information. Anna, why are you telling us this? What's the alternative?
Well, the first thing that I want to say to you is, in putting this information together, as you can see, all of this information is in the public domain. This is not me giving an opinion. This is just me joining up the dots to see the bigger picture. And I think the question you asked me there is, why am I doing it? Because the fact of the matter is that the country is locked down. It is having a devastating impact on people. You know, in a few moments, I'm going to be speaking about the effect it's having on people who have cancer. Then you have, I suppose, I think 500,000 people that are currently out of work. There's 25 billion euro that's going to be borrowed this year to pay for lockdown, to add to the debt, so that the Irish people are going to be the most indebted nation in Europe. And this has all to do with lockdown, and antigen testing is just part of a suite of measures that could be used to open up the country, to allow people to get back to work and to allow people to move about freely again.
I think that expose that you've done, Anna, on specifically on the misinformation or the conflicting information, which again is not your opinion, it's out there. It's about the journalists latching onto this and actually exploring it further, which they're not doing, only you are. There's the conflicting information about the antigen testing, but there's other factors as well. For instance, the idea of antibodies, and that a very large proportion of the population most probably have or a significant proportion have antibodies because they've already had COVID and their body has developed natural responses to that. But there doesn't seem to be any focus on that when it comes to the Irish strategy or the national strategy. And there's another area. And as well as that, something that emerged over the last couple of weeks that's interesting in terms of conflicting science and where our science is coming from, and if our chief medical officer and all the others who are responsible for checking this out and keeping us safe, if they're really looking at the research. You might recall at the beginning and in the middle of this so-called pandemic, we had a situation where we were told that viruses were surviving on surfaces, outside houses, inside houses. They were surviving for hours, days, weeks, even months, some of the so-called research was saying. It's transpired that all of that research was very much flawed, and that they were putting what was called viral overloads onto surfaces and in ideal conditions for viruses, and then seeing how long they would survive. And obviously they lasted quite a long time, and much longer than they would in a normal situation. So it's been revealed over the last few weeks that it's actually the chance of actually catching COVID from a surface in a normal environment is actually very low. And yet we have spent the last, or many people have spent the last year, scrubbing everything down, leaving their groceries outside for days before taking it in, things like that. And it turns out that but here's the thing, that was the advice that was being given by our experts, the people in the state who are paid and are charged with the responsibility of keeping us safe. And not one of them bothered to actually look at the research to check it out. And I think that's very telling. And I think that maybe is reflected in your earlier report as well, Anna, that there were statements being made about the research being carried out when in fact it wasn't carried out. And it may be that our so-called experts in Ireland are not even bothering to look. Would that be a rightful conclusion, do you think, Anna?
Well, it's very hard to say, but just as a general observation that I have noticed over the years, that people in Ireland are appointed to positions in the public service, not because of what they know, but because of who they know. And it's just my opinion. I think that these people in these positions of power, they don't deliberately set out to do wrong, but they end up doing wrong because they're incompetent. They don't actually have the know-how. Now, the other thing that greatly concerns me is that there's a report in the media today that the Cabinet is to shortly consider, given what they're calling now this new term, a vaccine bonus. So they're considering giving a vaccine bonus to people. Those who have been vaccinated will be allowed to travel abroad for holidays this summer. And that greatly concerns me because it is a fact that the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID. And it's also been scientifically proven that it doesn't stop you from spreading COVID. What the vaccine does is that it minimizes the harm that COVID will do to you if you are unfortunate enough to get it. So this begs the question, why should travel be limited to only those who have been vaccinated? Because they stand possibly a greater risk of spreading the virus, for example, than people who have the antibodies. As you said, if you've already had COVID, your body has built up antibodies to it.
And that's in the science as well. That's not our opinion, Anna. That's scientific fact. Yeah. That's been proven time and again over the last few months in particular, as research has been able to close off on these issues.
Yes, and I suppose the other thing is that rapid antigen testing could be used to great effect to allow people to travel. So I don't know. I suppose we have arrived at a situation is that the government and NPHET have pushed out the boat, and they will push it as far as they can push it. And there has up until now been probably very, very, very little pushback from the Irish people. But I do detect a sea change. If we look at that interview today with Pat Kenny and Stephen Donnelly, for the first time, I would imagine Pat Kenny is actually challenging the minister, and he's pushing the science. And if we look at the response to Professor Michael Mina's tweets following his interview on prime time, the responses underneath that came from various medics and other scientists, all supporting Professor Mina's view. And the response to the tweet by News Talk underneath Stephen Donnelly's interview today with Pat Kenny, I noted that ISME actually replied and said to Stephen Donnelly, have you read our letter yet? So there is a pushback coming, but of course ISME represents small and medium-sized businesses, and they actually have been decimated by lockdown, and of course they are responsible for a huge amount of the taxes that's paid into the exchequer. So it just remains to be seen now if the Irish people will start to push back.
Yeah. Anna, your journalism tonight was particularly insightful and brave in the teeth of media manufactured public opinion. You've proven once again tonight that you're not afraid to expose what needs to be exposed and to bring the facts to the forefront, because those facts are out there. They're available to all journalists, citizens journalists as well as professional journalists, and to the public. But it's about bringing those facts to the fore and putting them together in a clear way. And you did that this evening. I can assure you, the feedback online from your show, from your report tonight, you're getting so much positivity and so much support, not just in Ireland, but around the world. And I'd like to thank you for that. We're going to now return back to Anna Kavanagh for her usual slot, her news and views, where Anna will look at some of the other news and events over the last few days and give her views on them. Over to you, Anna.
You're very welcome to this week's news and views for the second week in May 2021. And tonight I'm going to be looking at a number of issues, among them Irish water, the increasing power of big tech in Ireland, and a country that's really very difficult place for the young and for the elderly. But first, we'll go to Irish water. A report published on Monday by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as the OECD, called for the reintroduction of water charges in Ireland alongside increased carbon taxes and higher waste charges. In response, the Taoiseach said, we won't be going back to that. We won't be introducing water charges. Martin Wall reported in yesterday's Irish Times that industrial action is almost inevitable in the months ahead over government plans to transfer about 3,500 staff from local authorities to Irish Water. Force, the trade union representing local authority staff, warned about this on Tuesday ahead of their AGM, which was held yesterday. A report in today's Irish Independent by Anne-Marie Walsh says that local authority staff will not agree to any transfer to Irish Water in the absence of a referendum to underpin public ownership and control of Irish water. Force's AGM heard yesterday that local authority staff have growing fears that the proposal to move them from the local authorities to Irish water employment will be a stepping stone to water privatisation unless a referendum takes place first. Force's National Secretary Peter Nolan told the Union Conference, if workers are forced to transfer to Irish Water against their will, their anger and alienation will create a failed entity, a mortally wounded service, and a public policy debacle to dwarf previous protests over water charges. And speaking of charges, it was announced in the Mail on Sunday newspaper that it appears Tánaiste Leo Varadkar will not be charged for leaking confidential government documents. The report says Gardaí are sending a file to the DPP recommending that Varadkar face no criminal charges for the leak. This represents a new law in high places where lawmakers have become lawbreakers. And more now on the subject of confidentiality. From Saturday, you won't be able to use WhatsApp unless you allow it to share your information with Facebook. From this Saturday, your WhatsApp will tell you that unless you agree to the new terms and conditions, you will lose access to your chat list and eventually messages and calls. Ian O'Doherty, the Irish Independent columnist, in response to Facebook's announcement that they will be continuing with the ban on Donald Trump from their social media platform, wrote, and I quote, "All of us, regardless of our politics, should be deeply concerned about allowing so much power to rest in so few hands. These companies simply have too much power, and whatever your views on Trump, surely we can all agree that we're wandering down a very dangerous road when we allow tech billionaires choose what we can and cannot see. Trump today, tomorrow it could be you." Gareth McDade is a technology consultant. He tweeted on Tuesday that up to 6 months ago in the tech company where he works, they hired only people who are resident in Ireland. But in the last 6 months, the majority of new hires on his team live and pay their taxes in other countries. Remote working is now resulting in a massive shift in how multinationals like Google and Facebook, headquartered here in Ireland, can now recruit workers abroad. They can recruit these workers more cheaply and they will pay no tax here. The question is, are we going to witness redundancies on a massive scale in the months and years ahead as a result of this move? The knock-on effect of low wages alongside rising rents means millennials in their 20s and 30s are likely to be the first generation in Ireland to have lower living standards than the previous one, according to research conducted by the ESRI that was published this week. Now, historically, every generation since the foundation of the state has enjoyed a higher standard of living than the one gone before. The Irish Times asked readers to share their experience. Susan Coffey wrote, "I'm now 31, recently married, and my husband and I have decided to treat ourselves by renting a place by ourselves with a bedroom that has a working radiator, my first in 10 years, and the cost $2,400 a month. An eye-watering high price, but once we pay every month while meeting our other financial obligations, it's tight, but we manage. We have put off having a child as we want the security of a permanent home for our future child. We've had the full deposit plus associated fees for purchasing a home in our account for years, but we can't buy in Cavan when our jobs are in Dublin. We have sacrificed so much in the hope of purchasing a home, but here we are with no idea where we will live next year once the lease ends. The effect this has on my mental health is immeasurable. We have begun to look at our options in terms of emigrating as beyond feeling totally hopeless in our endeavour to ever own a home. I feel so let down by successive governments who have allowed this situation to worsen year on year. And finally, from the woes of our young people, we turn our attention to the sick and the elderly. AINTU leader Peadar Tóibín issued a statement on Monday saying 9,000 people died from cancer last year, which is 3 times the number of COVID-related excess deaths, according to the CSO. Cancer services are still not fully operational until the end of the year. Deputy Tóibín also issued a statement saying that there are serious questions for the government to answer after revelations that over half of those who died of COVID-19 in the state contracted the virus either in a nursing home or in hospital. Deputy Tóibín said, and I quote, "It is becoming more and more evident that throughout this pandemic, the most vulnerable have been left the most exposed to COVID. we have confirmation that 56% of the people who died with COVID in the state contracted the virus either in hospital or in nursing homes. The HSE have confirmed this week that roughly 750 people who caught the virus while in hospital have died, and we know that more than 2,000 people of those who died from COVID were nursing home residents. It is a truly shocking statistic, he said. I want to thank you most sincerely for watching, and I make a little plea to you now to please share the video to get the news out to a much wider audience. And as always, I like to leave you with a question that you can ponder in the days ahead. One of the definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. And the question that I have for you tonight is, how long more are we going to tolerate the insanity that is sweeping this country before there is a genuine pushback from the Irish people?
As usual, a very good question to leave us with tonight, Anna. Everything seems very negative. Everything seems very down. But there are cracks, aren't there, Anna? There are signs that not only in terms of COVID, but in terms generally of ethics and applying good old-fashioned values that about human rights and things like that. There are cracks appearing. Would you agree with me?
Yes. And I suppose through the chinks comes in the light. And I suppose the one thing that really keeps me hopeful is the fact that the vast majority of people in Ireland have a huge wealth of innate goodness and mercy and love. And I think that that is going to win out in the end.
Yeah, I think when they're presented with common sense information and things that like what you brought to the Irish people this evening. We had a lot of viewers, and I said a lot of support came online through the chat room. We're a little bit over our time this evening. I'd like to thank Anna Kavanagh for the massive amount of work that you put in for tonight's show in what I think was should be an award-winning piece of journalism in our report this evening. But I'm sure it won't win any awards in Ireland in the near future anyway. I'd like to thank Stephen Kerr and Danny in our Dublin studio, Stephen McDowell in our Dundalk studio, and we'll see you next week at 9 o'clock for the Irish Inquiry on Thursday for Double Down. Talk to you then.